Welcome to Waking Up is Not Enough, Flourishing in the Human Space. Whether you awaken through meditation, spiritual practice, near-death experience, ingesting a mind-altering substance, or being born again, you still return to your messy life without any special instructions. In this podcast, Polly Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger talk with scientists, spiritual teachers, and other experts about how awakening can connect to a new path for flourishing and development on which waking up is important, but not enough, and growing up is never finished. Polly and Mike bring different kinds of expertise to the conversation. Polly is a psychologist, Jungian analyst, mindfulness teacher, author, and longtime practitioner of Zen Buddhism, as well as the founder and director of the Center for Real Dialogue. Mike is an expert in psychedelics, an entrepreneur, a skeptic, a practitioner of Jewishness, a documentary filmmaker, and a real dialogue specialist. The Center for Real Dialogue produces and edits this podcast entirely through donations. We want to keep it available for free to our listeners. Our unique perspective needs to be supported by people like you. Please make a donation on our GoFundMe platform, introduce our podcast to family and friends, and support us on social media. We genuinely need the support of all of our entire community, and we're grateful for it. Seth Segall is a Zen Buddhist priest and a retired clinical psychologist who served on the clinical faculty of the Yale University School of Medicine for nearly 3 decades. He is a contributing editor to Tricycle, the Buddhist magazine, and a review editor for The Humanistic Psychologist, and a science writer for Mindfulness Research Monthly. He teaches at Pamsula Zen of Westchester and the New York Insight Meditation Society.
So, hi, Mike.
Hi, Polly. How are you?
I'm good. It's really great to be back with you. And today we're here with a really very good friend of mine and someone with whom I have a lot of overlap. And this is Seth Segall, or I could say Dr. Seth Segall, or I could also say his Zen name. But I think what I will be emphasizing is the overlap in Seth's experience between being a clinical psychologist and a longtime practitioner of clinical psychology on the clinical faculty in the Department of Medicine, or perhaps I think it was medicine at Yale, and also has written a number of books. And today we're going to be talking about his most recent book, which is called The House We Live In. The book covers virtues and wisdom, but also 3 forms of deep spiritual and material philosophy coming from 3 different traditions. This new book, which is really wonderful, and I recommend it to anyone who's interested in democracy, is called The House We Live In, Virtue, Wisdom, and Pluralism. And I want to welcome Seth Segall.
It's good to be here. Thanks for the introduction, Polly.
The first thing that I want to ask you, which is what Mike and I always ask of anyone coming on to this podcast, is what you think waking up is, or we sometimes call it awakening, you can call it enlightenment, what you think it is or how you describe it, the elevator pitch type of situation, and then your own experiences in that.
Well, it's not going to be an elevator pitch because I think for me that it just opens up a whole can of worms anytime we use those words. I mean, I don't think awakening or enlightenment is a single thing or always the same thing. So I want to first of all distinguish between awakening experiences, which people may have, whether we want to call them mystical experiences or religious experiences or meditative experiences or psychedelic experiences, or whatever we want to call them, and being awakened. I think those are 2 different things. I've certainly known people who've had many important religious experiences and yet are terrible human beings. So I wouldn't want to give them the designation of being awakened. And I also don't want to say that every awakening experience is the same. I think when William James wrote about the varieties of religious experience, I think there are many different types of religious experience. For example, in Buddhism, we always talk about a kind of unitive experience where we experience oneness, with the world. But in Martin Buber's book, I Am Thou, he talks about the fundamental religious experience as being a dialogue with the other. We can say that St. Teresa's religious experience and Meister Eckhart's religious experience were not the same. And I think that makes sense when you think about how rich and complex the nature of reality really is. All we can really get is a glimpse into the way things are, but it's not the totality of everything. And there's no way that any of us, with our little brains, can see the totality of everything. So, and I think that if we look at all the Zen masters, starting with, say, Bodhidharma in China and coming through today, I don't think all of their experiences were the same. I think they all had some different kind of glimpse or awakening. For example, and I think also the idea of awakening is historically conditioned, so that what awakening for us now in 2024 is different from what it might have been in China in the year 1000. We read about the Japanese Zen masters during World War II, for example, who certainly met all the criteria in their era for being enlightened and yet supported the Japanese war effort in World War II and encouraged soldiers to go out and kill, because there is no real killing, there is no real death, and so forth. They had an idea of the oneness of all existence that allowed you to go ahead and kill, and it was perfectly okay, and in fact patriotic. And I think nowadays when we think about waking up, we also think about wokeness. Okay, so that we hope that people today who are woken up will feel different about transgendered people or gay people or people from other cultures, will feel differently about them than people, say, 1,000 years might have felt about it, or 100 years ago might have felt about it. So
I think I'm going to ask you something here, because it's going so far now that I can't actually help myself, or I'll forget to come back.
okay.
I think Mike and I, we've talked so many times about the individuality of perception and how we don't escape our own mindset, our viewfinder, our virtual headset, whatever you want to use as the metaphor. Each of us is a particular manifestation with particular language, particular points of view. And of course, those are inescapable, as would be all the cultural issues that frame what we take to be, let's say, even speakable or perceivable. Those things change over time, no question about it. All of this really is evolving. And then individuals cannot be other than individuals. For humans, our perceptions, our self-awareness are always first person.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's inescapable. So I completely agree with you that waking up or awakening is always individual, and that it doesn't surpass or bypass that. And when I think of Shakyamuni Buddha's awakening, his first experience, at least as it's recorded 454 years after he had it, was to say that he didn't want to teach. He didn't want to teach this because it might be harmful. People couldn't understand it. And then, by at least one account, he went to all of the heavens, all of the different levels of heaven, asking there, who's in charge? And at each level, the answer was, I don't know. I arrived here, I'm not sure who's in charge. So he got to the highest heaven. There were two gods there, and he asked, and they said, we don't know. And at that point, he realized we're all in charge. And so it is, our own subjective experience in which we are enlightened, and that changes the world. And nobody gets the whole world in their enlightenment in a way that they can capture it. And the Buddha then, also had previously left his son and his wife. And by the time he was dying, he was still fighting with his cousin. So he was a human being in that way. And so because of that, I'm going to ask you one other question here about what you've just said. I am hearing you say, and let me see if I'm hearing accurately, that you believe that if someone is awake, that they have some kind of ethical principles that they're going to follow, either in the way they include other kinds of people, or in the way that they don't do scandals, or in the way that they are essentially, I don't know, honest or virtuous. So I'm wanting to check that out. If you believe that awakening or enlightenment necessarily leads to being a really good person by everybody's standards.
Well, first of all, we all fail at that. None of us are really good people by everybody's standards, but I think there is an ethical component to it, absolutely, in the way I understand it. There are two questions left that I want to address in what was opened up in the initial question. One is, what experiences have I had? And the other is, what do I think awakening is? Okay, given everything I've done as preface. So another thing I want to say about awakening, awakening is that it's not a single dimension. I think I think there are multiple dimensions to awakening that are not totally independent, but they're semi-independent. So for me, awakening includes an element of what you might call presence or mindfulness, awareness of the present moment, and contact with what's happening right around you, being aware of that, being aware of what's happening inside your body, being aware of your emotions and your thoughts, and having that kind of open, spacious perspective on things. And a kind of immediacy and presence where people say, hey, he or she is really here right now with me. Okay, so when you're with other people, there's a sense of, I'm not somewhere else, I'm really there with you. So that ability to be present is an important part. I think there's an attitude that an awakened person brings to life, which is when they come to a situation, they ask, how can I help, instead of what's in it for me? So I think there's a less self-centered kind of approach to the world that takes the well-being of other beings and things into account whenever we're looking into any situation. I think there's the ability to kind of step back from our own whims and urges and desires and to see them arise and know that we don't have to act on all of them, so we become less impulsive. I think there is a character development in which things like honesty, integrity, courage, benevolence, those become part of character more and more over time. I think that it's the ability to understand that the world is not made up of things, but it's made out of complex interaffecting processes that are really part of one large movement of everything together. The ability to, when you're with somebody else, to really hear them and not just hear your own thoughts about what's going on, but to see that they have their own point of view and their own perspective, and that there's something there you can learn from and appreciate. So for me, those are all different aspects of that same process. I think there's a way in which, as you progress along a path, if there is a path, that there's a way that these all kind of gel together in some kind of way. Just as in Buddhism, we talk about the Eightfold Path, all the different eight aspects are form one whole at the end of the path, not at the beginning. So I think there's a way they all fit together in some way, but I think for most of us, we have to look at it as single dimensions in which we grow, and at different points in our life, we grow in different ways. In terms of my own experiences, I want to compare a couple of experiences because they weren't the same. That was what was interesting to me about them. So I think about my first LSD experience, for example, maybe 18 years old at the time. I'm a very serious LSD taker. I'm not a casual fun taker. So I've read my Huxley. Alan Watts came to my university. I heard his lectures and I read his books, and I read Leary and Albert and Metzger, and so and then I was in the Vermont mountains in a wonderful cabin, and I had an experienced LSD guide, and they were playing Vivaldi's Four Seasons on the phonograph. We had not stereo, it was a phonograph at the time, right? And I had this wonderful experience. I had no colors, no lights, no hallucinations, no visual distortions at all. Just clarity was the feeling. And what came from that experience was a sense of the oneness and unity of everything, and the sense of, I don't know what the word is to use, but the sense of the sacredness or specialness of even the most ordinary thing, that everything was amazing. Not that it looked distorted or colored, I think, but I said, this is the way things really are, if you can really see them, That was that experience. It was a wonderful experience, and in one way, it changed my life. I was different from that experience than I was before it. But it wasn't just in one dimension, but it was an important one. So up until that point, I would have said that I was somewhat schizoid. I had had a recurring nightmare from age 4 on. Didn't occur very frequently, but it occurred from time to time, that I had this like glass bowl, like a fish bowl or a space helmet over my head, and I couldn't get it off. And I think whenever I was in groups or with other people, I always felt like there was some pane of glass or some separation between them that I couldn't break through in some kind of way. I couldn't establish any kind of intimate relations with, girlfriends. People just stayed friends, even if I wanted to be a boyfriend or something, it just couldn't happen. But after that experience, that never happened again, ever in my life. Wherever I was, I felt I belonged there. I felt I was right where I should be. I never felt that separation anymore. The dream never reoccurred of the helmet, So that was an important change in my life. But I was still just an 18-year-old kid with all the lack of development that an 18-year-old has and all the obliviousness that an 18-year-old has. And so I wouldn't say I woke up in that moment. It was just that some part of my life had improved in a way that has been meaningful to me and important to me. The other experience I want to talk about was on a meditation retreat over at Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts. And maybe it was about 7 or 8 days into it. And while I was inside the meditation hall, I had this experience of great peace and equanimity and so forth, that I went outside to take a walk afterwards. And what it felt like was everything was love. And tears was just streaming out of it. I would see a tree and touch it, and I could feel that I loved it and it loved me, and the whole world was this glorious golden. And it lasted maybe 30 minutes or so, that experience, and then gradually faded. But I didn't get experience of unity of things, you know. It was a feeling instead that love pervades the universe. Totally different experience. So what happened in that experience? I don't know. Did my heart chakra open up and I was projecting that onto the world, or is the world really pervaded by, you know, a kind of, is the world really a loving place in some deep way? My brain isn't big enough to figure that one out. But it was a deep experience. It informed my life going forward and my understanding of my practice. It became a much more heartfelt practice from then on. But but it was very different than initial. It was a totally different experience than the initial one of unity and sacred and the specialness of everything. I think that's what I want to say, that we can have these experiential lives and they inform us and they become touchstones that we can reflect back on later on and help guide us in our life and our growth. But they're different. Each of them are different in some kind of way. They wake us up in a different kind of way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. And I think each one of us has experiences that are essentially different as well. The one thing that I want to return to from this opening, and we're going to go to a lot of other things, is the issue of judging anyone else's awakening, you know, and also because some of the teachers that I have learned a great deal from, and I'm just going to point to Sasaki Roshi because it's easy, there's a lot of public information about him. He behaved in ways that I feel are egregious. I know he also rationalized those things. On the other hand, I believe he was truly awake.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that his awakening was subtracted from his behavior. I think his behavior was a part of personality, his personality that had not yet, let's say, been taken into his self-awareness, that it was some aspect of his own unconsciousness, and given his culture and whatever his experiences had been, he was not aware of the harmfulness of it. And I don't think that I'm aware of the harmfulness of things that I do that are truly harmful. That even though in my own practices, since I've had multiple awakening experiences and they've been very, very different, and then I've tried to build on them by studying ancient Buddhism and a lot of other things as well, but I still do harmful things. And many times I notice it after the fact, or sometimes somebody else brings it to my attention and I'm not sure if I really did that or not. You know, if it's a certain way of seeing somebody, or particularly I'm thinking of my adult children now, the feedback they give me and so on and so forth. So, you know, I don't leave out any masterful teacher who's acted badly as being awakened if that teacher has brought forth something that's recognizable to me as deeply awakened. And I do feel my standards are fairly high for that because I've been with many, I'd say a handful of Tibetan masters, Japanese masters, and then also American teachers that I've recognized as awake. And they haven't all acted perfectly as humans.
I think we have to talk about definitions here, because for me, I would have said that someone like Sasaki Roshi or Ida Roshi or any of these other, or Trungpa, for example, they might have been aspects of them that were awakened, but they weren't awake as some kind of final, oh, they're totally awake. They're not. So let's just say, I've never met anyone that would say he's enlightened, meaning in every aspect of life they radiate enlightenment, you know, and we've met, you know, we've been in the Dalai Lama's presence, you know, I've been in Thich Nhat Hanh's presence, you know, I've known a lot of wonderful teachers, but none of them have ever told me they're awakened, you know, and I wouldn't consider them, as much as I consider them admirable people who have given something important to me in my life and have helped me see some things in some deeper ways than I did before. I don't want to give them credit. I don't want to put them up on this pedestal. Let's just say there are aspects of their life that are realized and other aspects that are unrealized, just like all the rest of us.
I never say totally awake. I mean, that's just not a language I'd use. But I wonder if you think enlightenment or awakening is sort of asymptotic, like it's just out there, but nobody's actually gotten to it yet.
I think it is asymptotic. Yeah, I think it's a horizon you point towards and you make progress along, but nobody ever gets there.
Okay.
And even if you got there for one moment, it doesn't mean you'd stay there.
Okay, that clarifies it for me anyway, because I actually see it a little differently, but now I'm understanding you better. Yes, okay. And Mike, do you want to...
Ida Roshi is a Zen master here, or was in the New York area, that became the center of some controversy, and he harmed a lot of people. And I've spoken to those people that he harmed. And when my rakusu, my ritual garment, has a wooden part on a ring on it that was made by one of the people who put up a set of archives that documented all the things that Ida Roshi did wrong. But I also know two of his students,
Mhm.
who got things from him. One of them still reveres him. The other
Mhm.
one was his personal attendant for many years, and when he left was totally disillusioned in many ways, and it took him 10 years to trust his next Zen master because he kept on watching him for any signs of impropriety and finally accepted him as his teacher.
Mhm.
But still, he would have said that his experience with Adaroshi was a deeply meanptul experience for him, and he
Mhm.
got something out of it.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say that anyone is so bad that you can't get that the right person couldn't get the right thing from them. But if you were the person that in Dakusan was sexually molested by him, you wouldn't have the same feeling about him.
Yeah, well, I think, I can't say, there are so many complicated things that we're now kind of diving into without having gone to the
Yeah.
main things. But I think that partly the issue in talking about awakening, thinking about it, is to recognize our own subjectivity, and that our subjectivity leans towards this or that, or it's limited in this or that way. Over time, I've gotten much more modest about calling out people.
Okay.
There was a period where I was all for it, and then I started to realize that the people that were doing the calling out weren't always the people I admired the most. They weren't the people that I was leaning into, and but I was joining up with them. And so, I'm now more reticent to fault, particularly the teachers that I have been affected by, some of whom have done harmful things. No question about it. No question about the harmful things. And yet the teachings are extraordinary. They are enlightened and enlightening teachings, as far as I can tell from everything I experience. And I can see the light. I'm a good friend of Mark Uno's, and I
Hmm.
was never practicing with Sasaki Roshi, but Mark told me that in Sanzen, when people would walk into the room to question Sasaki individually, the room would be filled with golden light. In other
Hmm.
words, he exuded golden light, and it was absolutely palpable. You could not ignore it, and that capacity is an unusual capacity. And so, even in that capacity, he was also doing some harmful things to people.
I think it's no different than when we think about great artists.
I agree with
Wagner created great music, and I'd never want to have a beer with him.
that.
And I can still enjoy Woody Allen's films, can I? I don't know. We go through these questions all the time. Philip
Yeah, of
Roth had terrible views about women, and yet some of his books are the best books I've ever read. I mean,
course, of course. I would think it
let's
would be
let's not deny that that's true about everybody, that there are
about
good parts and bad
everybody.
parts to them.
Yes, and so it seems to me that that needs to be true about the Zen teachers also who have behaved badly, or the
But,
Tibetans who behaved badly.
but I'm saying, even though we can get something from, let's not put them on pedestals and think that they're actually better than they are. That's what I want to warn against.
So, Mike, do you want to jump in here before we
Sure.
haven't yet gotten into the conversation about your book? But
Well, I find it interesting in listening to your definition of awakening. So, before we started recording, we asked if you had listened to any of the podcasts. You had not. And yet, in listening to your definition of awakening, we keep circling around the same definitions. It, whoever comes on and joins us, again, has a very different approach, but there's an underlying theme to our perceptions of awakening. And in relation to this last part of the conversation, I want to bring up, because I know your work, you play with paradox and flourishing and our relationship to community and our interconnectedness. So, one of the challenges that I'm seeing in the real world of building community are that how does the community police itself? We're talking about not just calling out. If there are members of the community that seem to be engaged in harmful, repetitive harmful behavior or behavior that harms other members of the community, do I have an obligation not to call them out, but to try to hold them accountable or to protect the vulnerable in the community?
I think that answer is yes. If we're all members of the same community, we have responsibilities to each other, and we have an aim to try to improve the other person's behavior, make them aware of what they're doing, and see if that can be valued. But if that doesn't work, we still have to warn those people who are vulnerable, be very careful. This person may have something to offer you, but don't go alone into a room with them, with a closed door.
So one of the difficult challenges on this journey, on this path of awakening, is some people interpret their individual awakening as a sign that they are God, which justifies the most horrible behaviors. And yet, from their expressed perspective, they seem to be expressing, I've received this download. I'm now a shaman. I'm now the great teacher. So I'm divinely justified in behaving this way because I'm bringing awakening to all of you.
That's right. I'm using crazy wisdom, skillful means, right? That's right.
Yes,
That's
yes.
right.
So
I think we have to use our own judgment about whether something really looks skillful. And unfortunately, we're not always able. Sometimes we're mesmerized or hypnotized by the charisma of the person we're with, that we can't see that what they're doing is just plain harmful and selfish. I was reading an account of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's community and what went on in there. It was an expose, right? So we don't have to believe everything in it, but still there was an enormous amount of collusion with some very harmful things he was doing to people, and people just did not see it. Some people still don't see it, you know.
So I live 45 minutes away from that community in Vermont. So I have seen in therapy, just many, many people connected to that community. Like Barry Magid said, my specialty is neurotic Buddhists here where I live, because I was in what was really a Buddhist ghetto. Now, some of those groups have moved away, but I just think there are many angles on all of these things. There are many things to say about Trungpa, about the Sakyong, about his family, et cetera, et cetera. But to try to circle back to something we said earlier about, let's say, LSD,
Mm-hmm.
or earlier, even before MDMA, those things get idealized and put on a pedestal also.
Absolutely.
And they can be harmful too.
Mm-hmm.
And so, all of the things that are involved with waking up or becoming, let's say, having direct awareness of the oneness aspect of being here. Let's just say being here. And, I don't mind if people say space-time, the universe, or samsara, whatever it is you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
It's limited, it's completely interdependent, and it's not perfectible. So being here is not perfectible.
Yes.
So, looking around at whatever promises the Enlightenment thing, it's going to have some imperfection. And that includes the psychedelics, it includes the near-death experience, because you could die. If you're going to have a near-death experience, you could just die. That's dangerous too. Don't go after that. Shaktipat, being born again, all of these things are methods or ways to try to have this kind of experience, and they're all imperfect. And so, I don't want to hold Trungpa to, let's say, greater standards than I would hold MDMA. I know MDMA interacts with different individuals differently. I know sometimes it's dangerous and sometimes it's not dangerous. I've looked at the research on it, talked to Jill Bolte Taylor about it. None of these things that we use, including people's teachings from Buddhism, are perfectible. And this is kind of the framework this is the momentary framework I'm in about this. I also think that the teachers that came to the US from Asia, roughly, only 50 years ago or so, just a little bit, maybe more than 50 years ago, they were not coming from cultures like ours. And they did not have the guidelines about how to behave here. And they tumbled into the situation. Many of them also had their character flaws or whatever, their personalities they brought with them. I think at the beginning, of course, they were given a lot of leeway because there was a placebo effect. Just like there's a placebo effect with taking drugs. There's a placebo effect in anything. At the beginning, it looks like it's very hopeful, very different, very promising. And then as you go along, the imperfections start to come out. And so that's the way I look now at Kamacholing, Shambhala. What Trungpa was doing had great promise, and he worked extremely hard at it. And he was also pretty honest about his flaws. And at the same time, his community did a lot of harm, and so did he. But I don't know. I wasn't there. I never went to him as a teacher. I was with Philip Kapleau, who was an American during this time.
Mm-hmm.
Philip Kapleau was very, very ethical.
Yes.
But in a certain way, he didn't have the talents of Trungpa. So, there was a trade-off there. So I'm just trying to bring what I consider the complexity of this imperfectibility into the entire conversation about how do you get enlightened or awake or whatever, whether you do it this way or that way, it's not going to be perfect. And perhaps because some of the Tibetan teachers use words that are translated as like my perfect teacher, they use a word that gets translated as perfect. Perhaps there's some confusion, for people about that. It's not perfect in that way of being everything is going to work out well. It's just
So let me just say, Polly, that A, in general, I agree with everything you said, but B, I'm probably less forgiving and more critical than you are.
Well, the variability of individual experience that we bring to whatever life is about. I think back to what I recall Seth saying about first presence in awakening. I mean, these are some of the keys, the seemingly fundamental key aspects to evaluating, I guess for me, the quality or character of one's journey. I particularly am fond of how can I help versus what's in it for me. I think this is a great way to evaluate others' behavior in terms of harm. People who tend to show up to help seem to be I guess, those two categories there. It seems to me that the people who pose as being helpful in the guise of really what's in it for me are the ones who seem to commit the most egregious harms. And this is connected to your next point, which was about stepping back from desire. And also, this is connected to character. So how do we, and I bring this back to the interconnection of building a functional community based on right thought and action. And so if we take the perspective of how my individual behavior is connected to this community and the ripples of both my thoughts and deeds throughout the community, and then there can be, I think, a way to evaluate that which is harmful from that which is nourishing, and then creating boundaries in the community to protect the most vulnerable from the people who are not there to nourish, they're there to take. And it's not a judgment on them because, as you're pointing out, we're in different places on our journey. Some people are not even, they don't even know there's a journey. There are other people who've spent their whole life on a journey thinking that there's an aim or an end, but it's the journey. There's nowhere to go because it's all happening right now, right here. But the way our minds seem to be enculturated is to not be able to be present, to not ask, how can I help, but to ask what's in it for me. These are the messages that we seem to be bombarded with. And then, in terms of part of the theme of the whole podcast is about waking up in stages of development. And I think it's beautiful how I hear that encapsulated in what I hear you describing in terms of, it's from the conformist level that many of the shenanigans take place. And so one of the great challenges is that the majority of the people who may be hearing what we're talking about may not be able to actually hear what we're talking about because they're going to hear it from wherever they are on their journey. And I think this goes to another point I heard you bring up about being able to hear out, to listen to the other, not the voice in my head, which also goes to non-judgment. It's the voice in my head where I compare myself to others or I judge others that leads to problems in community and interconnectedness. You also brought up character and relationship. And I think all of this is part of us learning how to progress in one sense in our own development to be able to show up from the approach of, I want to try to help, but there's also a time where that may not be the appropriate approach. In the same way that, like a particular philosophy or philosopher, a particular psychedelic drug in and of itself, to me, one of the most bizarre findings is that psychedelics have no specific effect, unlike any other types of drugs, right? It's about the experience of the experiencer. So as you described, you could take LSD twice in the same exact setting. You're the same person, at least you think, but you have two entirely different experiences. And I also find it interesting. I know so many people, I've met many people who seem to desire the visual and auditory hallucinations as some kind of mark of that experience. And I've rarely, if ever, experienced those myself. I'm like you, have had these moments of clarity, which is an entirely different experience from being wowed by colors and hallucinations. So, again, I think it's so much about our expectations, our perspective, and what we bring to our interactions. And if I can't hear what you're saying or I can't see you, no matter how you show up, you don't show up for me in the way that you show up in the world. And I want to bring back this interweaving of paradox. So even in not even in your teaching, the paradox of becoming an idiot, I just think this is so perfect and beautiful to bring into this conversation.
So now I would like to go to your book. I
Okay.
we've made a kind of a large circle around your book, and I'm hearing what Mike's bringing in right now. You know, a lot of references to this book that is the focus of this particular podcast, which is entitled "The House We Live In: Virtue, Wisdom, and Pluralism." And you know, you open the book by making reference to "The House I Live In," which was a song by Frank Sinatra that I guess was quite popular in the 1950s. I must say, I did not hear it until about 3 years ago when my partner played it for me, because he grew up in California and apparently they played it in school almost every year and when I first heard it, I cried. I'd never heard the song, but it just brought tears to my eyes. But partly I was crying because of the period of time that it seemed to evoke, when things seemed to me to be more innocent, when America was a more positive place. I I was just brought back to those feelings in hearing the song. And so I wondered why you titled the book by that song, because it seems like we're in a different song now. You know, how you think about the America right now versus the house I live in time when it really was evoking something very different.
Well, I went to school, public school in New York, and in New York they played that song every year. And by the way, it's part of a film which you can look up on YouTube. It's still there. It's a very interesting film to look at. So it was a short that won an Academy Award back around somewhere in the mid 1940s. But the song says, has all races and religions, that's America to me. And it was part of a civics lesson in school. And I just absorbed it as a Jewish kid going to school in multi-ethnic New York. I just accepted it as, of course, that's what we all believe. We're Americans, you know. And I never realized this is a song written by the same songwriter who wrote Strange Fruit, and who was blacklisted during that period of time. Okay, He wrote it under a pseudonym for that film and received an Academy Award under a pseudonym for it. But he wrote it to express his view of what America was all about, and it was a contested view at that point, and it's still a contested view. So the idea that we are a multicultural society, multi-ethnic society, is an aspiration that we're still struggling with. And things were not any purer in the 1950s. It might have felt that way if you were white and male, and you know, but you had the Jim Crow in the South, you had the McCarthy era. I think that my view of democracy is it's always in peril at any given moment. You know, we know it didn't last very long in Athens. It didn't. The Roman Republic didn't last very long until Julius Caesar came along. It's always just in danger of dying, and always needs some kind of renewal to kind of continue to exist. So I think there's a sense that I have of democracy as being a very perilous accomplishment. It's always in a state of precarity and always requires certain kinds of efforts on the part of its citizenry to survive. So I think that was true in 1950 when people were sitting at the lunch counters down south and trying to begin to integrate the United States, or when the army hearings were going on about Joe McCarthy. My grandfather would watch those and I'd watch them with him, you know, back then. So that was a part of my life. But it's just as much a part today too. I think some things are different today. I think we're in an even more precarious period right now, and that was part of the motivation for writing the book, the 2016 election, and understanding how fragile democracy really is. But in some ways, I don't think that this time is different than any other time. I think we were in that period in the 1850s, right before the Civil War. You know, there have been many times when we've approached this. We were in this time during the Great Depression before FDR pulled the country out of it.
Part of the reason for writing the book is that this is your response to the fragileness of democracy.
And
And
and I see this is the continuing story of who belongs in America has been an issue from the very beginning of our creation.
of
Okay,
course.
so we can talk about the celebrations in the 1700s of what it meant to be American, that Swedes and Germans and Englishmen and Dutchmen could all get along in the same country and feel like they're Americans, right? This is a great accomplishment that we weren't, you know, but that didn't include Catholics, and it didn't include blacks, and it didn't include Native Americans, and it didn't include, and on and on and on, you know. So then the Irish began coming during the potato famine, okay? And there's a whole huge political movement in the 1850s called the Know Nothing Party, which is trying to
Right.
stop Catholics from coming in. And then the Chinese come in, you know, to build the railroads, and we have the Chinese Exclusion Act that's built. Chinese couldn't become American citizens until till 1942, I think it was. And South Asians couldn't become American citizens until the 1950s, the United States. It was illegal. Native Americans couldn't become citizens until the 1920s. You know, women couldn't vote until 1921 or whenever year it was. This has always been a story about including more and more, and now we have new people coming in, you know, and now the issue is about those people from Latin America who are poisoning the blood of our country. So this is a continuing story about who gets included. Do gays get included? Do women get included? You know, do transsexuals get included? Who gets included? And our idea of us. So,
Right.
so I think this is a continuing battle throughout history, and it's just our new iteration of it right now.
So you don't really think that there's, I mean, as you were speaking there, I grew up in a Cherokee Slovenian family in a working class neighborhood of Akron, Ohio, where the schools were integrated.
Hmm.
And so I had, you know, many opportunities to visit my African American friends. My aunt was Creole, lived next door. I mean, so I really grew up in an America that where there was a lot uh, of that kind of belief that I felt in the song. I didn't hear the song until just recently, but I felt that there was this ongoing sense of the working class being the real class that was supporting the country, because that's what my father narrated.
Hmm.
And he was working in a factory. He met my mother in a factory, and then went to the war. And yeah, there was, he had a very, very poor background. His father was murdered. His mother committed suicide. So it was traumatic, but there was a resilience, and the resilience was all around me. And I felt like I was in a special place, partly because we never traveled. So I only really ever saw for 18 years this one little area that was very integrated. And then I went away to Ohio University, which was over 200 miles away, and things were very different there.
Hmm.
So, I had this very sort of special kind of American experience. And now I'm, at the other end of that life, and things look very different to me. And that sense that I had of people being able to get along, and this idea that somehow having a different skin color was not the deciding factor. And also, there weren't any other classes. It was very homogeneous. I was in this working class area. So I didn't have to deal with the class, the status, the wealth. There were many, many things that I didn't deal with. And now I see the country very differently. I mean, for many years I have. But I do wonder if we're in an unusual period of time now because of the kind of media that we have, and the ways that people communicate, that so that people can apparently see what's going on in Israel or Gaza, but they're not there. But they have, some interaction with it through their own sort of headset, or they believe they know what happened in Minnesota when George Floyd, when all of that happened. There's a way that there are many, many kinds of media that people consume now and have access to and have opinions about and judgments about in a way that was not true when I was growing up. Like there just wasn't that. So
Um,
for me, it's a big difference and makes this democracy more sort of confusing and
I,
complicated.
I think the biggest problem, I think that every time that there's a social change, and it could be due to new technology, or it could be due to immigration, or it could be due to social innovation. It could be, you think about globalization, for example, or financialization, or automation in the economy. Anytime there's a change, all of society has to kind of rethink in some kind of way what the norms of behavior ought to be in order to manage that change. So we can think about the fact that at the time that the Constitution is written, the only weapons people had were front-loading single-shot muskets. Okay, and a lot of people lived where you had to kind of shoot muskrats and stuff like that, and it made perfect sense for everybody to own a weapon. Okay, but there weren't automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons then. Once we invent something new, then there's a question about, well, should everyone have one or not? Everyone has to rethink it and come to some new agreement about it. Or you think about the way that the birth control pill, for example, changed sexual mores in the United States. So every innovation, life support or neonatal units, or the age at which children, can live in a NICU now, after being born prematurely, or the atom bomb, or the technology that creates global warming. I mean, all these things are disruptions. And the internet is another one where society has to kind of reorganize itself and readjust and think about the old rules. Do they still apply, or do we have to change them? Reaching a new consensus on new rules takes a very long time for people to do. It takes generations for that to happen. But change is happening so fast, okay, that it's very hard for society to kind of understand what that new consensus ought to be. So I think the rate of change has been exponential, and I think disturbs all the apple carts. So you have a lot of people who are discontent for a whole variety of reasons that you can't blame on any one person. So if a factory in Ohio goes out to China for maybe all kinds of reasonable reasons, but now you're without a job, the change in the financial structure means that more, say the invention of the whole tech industry means that all the money in the economy is being absorbed, up into that industry, and there's less money for other things. We've now become a knowledge economy instead of a manufacturing economy and so forth. All these disruptions change all kinds of things, that not only how much money people have, but what it changes sex roles. What is the role of men in a society where the role of manual labor is demoted, and the value of a college education is increased in some kind of way? How does that change? As women become more independent and have more power, and now more women go to college than men, and women are earning more and more every year while white men are earning less and less, how does that affect sexual role relations? Who gets married? Who's marriageable, and so forth? We're dealing with all of this right now, and I think that's where the discontent comes, and that's when people begin to look for simplistic answers from some charismatic or amusing clown, who promises to, at least let's throw the rascals out who created all the mess I'm in. I think that's when people begin looking for simplistic answers, and that's why we can't agree on things, because we're all in different portions of the world where different things are happening to us than to other people. It's very different to live in a rural America right now and live in New York City. It's different experience, different needs, different concerns. It's very hard for us to talk to each other.
That's right. I think that's right. I wondered if that's why you used the word pluralism in your subtitle rather than democracy. Pluralism is even hard to say. But it was
I picked up the word pluralism from the British philosopher Isaiah Berlin, who talked a lot about it when he was talking about what is liberalism. And he says the idea of liberalism is we don't know the answer of what the right way to live is. So we let everyone decide for him or herself. How should I live? What's a meaningful life for me? And it means there isn't going to be one vision of what that meaningful life is. For somebody, it's going to be, I want to create great art. For somebody else, it's going to be, I want to create a world where everything is fair. For someone else, it's going to be, I want to make as much money as I can. For someone else, it's going to be, I just want to raise my family and not be bothered by everything else going on. Everyone's going to have their own vision about what it means to live the good life for them. And we give the people that right to have their own decisions about how to conduct their lives and what the pursuit of happiness means for them. But that means that we're going to have to listen to a lot of different voices that think differently than us about things. And then when it comes to crucial issues, we have to reach some kind of way to figure out how to live together. It's not always
bring
easy.
Mike in here, but also just to say that let's segue then into these three great philosophies that you're introducing, because perhaps you're saying these are the guidelines that at least we can think about, because if there is such a sort of cacophony of voices and many people expressing their different desires, and many people, like the people I grew up in Akron, Ohio, where Akron now is just devastated. The roads don't work, the bridges are out, everything's really wiped out because the rubber factories left, and nobody has addressed that. It's not as though there's a group coming in to say, let's renew things. It's just declining. And the despair is pretty great. So there's not the feeling like we have another choice. We have choices here. It's more like we've been forgotten.
And then the question is whose fault it is, and let's throw the rascals out, right?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that is really what people are saying. Whose fault is it? I think what they're saying is we need help. Help, help. It's like, here we are. Help, please. So I do think that kind of pluralism that you were describing is idealized perhaps from a middle class perspective. And I'm just going to add that to the mix of things. Having grown up in the working class, having gone back to my 50th reunion to see what still high school, but now it's a living center. They have to have all sorts of activities there so they can provide 3 meals a day for the students who go there. that now is my junior high school and high school combined into the same building in the middle of this sort of wreckage of factories. So it's not a pretty sight. And yet still, and it's now almost entirely African American school, but it's a school where there's still a lot of resilience. There's a lot of desire for a future. I do think the idea of pluralism is kind of like an ideal. It's an ideal that somehow we could deal with all of these different voices, but who's going to get the goodies or make the decisions?
It's
So,
it's not an ideal. It's a recognition that we actually have competing and conflicting interests, and that's the way the world has always been and always will be. And somehow we have to find a way to get along as best we can without killing each other, despite the fact that we have different needs and different interests.
so yeah, I mean, I agree with you.
I just wanted to bring in, for one, the media landscape and how people are presented with information has changed enormously. In the past, you were quite limited to what was available. You only have to go back a century before there was even radio. And so the people who owned the newspapers were the people who decided the view of reality that you had. With the advent of radio and international communication, you had immediacy, things accelerated, you were exposed to much broader perspectives. And television took that a step further. I believe television was referred to as the God box when it first came out because people were mesmerized by the dancing images, especially color television. When you get to, I think about when CNN first came on the air, we're talking, it's almost 50 years, which is unimaginable. But CNN CNN's rise to prominence began with its coverage of the first Gulf War, that it brought it into everybody's homes. I think back to growing up with a black and white television at the dinner table, watching what was going on in Vietnam for my generation. In essence, other than the coverage, so look at the change in the way television covered war between Vietnam and the Gulf War. In Vietnam, you had reporters who risked their lives to cover what was going on in the jungles, what our soldiers were going through, what their daily lives were like, and the havoc we were wreaking on the civilian population in Vietnam. And it raised questions about what we were doing there. You saw the consequences of war in a way that you haven't seen since. And from Vietnam to the Iraq War, it was as if the media became a cheerleader for war. War was framed very differently. Shock and awe. It was entertainment as you watched people's lives get destroyed and lost. And it's continued on a path now where it appears that people can select the reality that they want to inhabit. One thing I find fascinating, this is something Timothy Leary very, very specifically wrote about and predicted in the mid 80s, that we were going to live in a screen reality future where people would be glued to screens where they could select the reality they wanted to have. And so now, I mean, I have so many experiences with people where we've lost the critical reasoning skills to discern fact from fiction. And people speak about truth where, I mean, we may be able to agree or seemingly are unable to even agree on facts, let alone what truth is. So it's a much more complicated time. And I believe the acceleration, as Alvin Toffler wrote about, the acceleration is taking place at such a rate that at least my personal experience is, I can't keep up with what's going on. And I try to keep up with the forefronts of like archaeology, quantum physics, psychology, neuroscience, the things that I'm very curious about to try to understand our world. The amount of information that one has access to is unlimited. We only have a limited lifetime. There's only so much time each day that I have to even try to begin to figure out what is going on, what I'm being told is true, versus my ability to figure out or find the facts myself. There's also a generational cynicism built in, which I believe is different. Maybe for the first time in a century, we have generations that expect to have a lower living of standard than their parents' generation. You have generations now who can't afford to rent an apartment, let alone the idea of them owning a home seems unrealistic to them, that it's beyond their reach. this has only happened in my lifetime, this shift. And I'd say really in the last 40 years. So when you have a system that's feeding you a certain picture of reality that is very different from the reality of your everyday life, and then you have all these options to find other people who are in the same silo or bubble with you that can reinforce these messages, we've moved beyond pluralism. And I don't know where or how we can find this common ground, because ultimately, when we're one on one and we speak to each other, we share so many things in common, no matter how far apart our views or perspectives of reality might be. We would agree most people want their kids to have an education, and they want their kids to have an opportunity to have a better life than I had. We want a habitable future where you don't have to worry about your drinking water, the air you breathe. And I believe most people want to see a world free of war and conflict. So all of this has shifted it so immensely, let's say, in the last 40 to 50 years, that for people born, let's say, after 9/11, or even maybe the 5 or 10 years, the decade before, there's a discontinuity with history, which is also something new. I think up until this time, there was a flow to history. We were connected with previous generations. We often shared the same living space with previous generations. We still lived in a community where neighbors knew your parents. So the community disciplined you. If you were out doing something you shouldn't do, either your neighbors disciplined you or your parents found out before you got home and disciplined you. And it seems that so many of these intergenerational values have been lost. And so how do we try to pull a coherent society when people seem to be able to see what they want to see, and they've lost, we no longer teach the same kind of critical reasoning that, I mean, even my generation, when I look at friends of mine who had come of age in the public school system in the 60s compared to my education, they seem to have had a much more comprehensive understanding of history, civics, how to live in the world. I know people now in their mid 20s who don't understand, they don't know how to write a check, let alone balance a checkbook. So I think in one sense, we've lost certain very basic skills of how to live with each other. And that's been substituted by this ease with which we can find whatever we want to find that confirms our bias. And so how do we address this, and how does this relate to those distinct traditions that you talk about in the book? How can that help educate and influence the people that we're hoping are hearing this and going, help, help?
So yes, let's go to the three traditions.
Well, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. You said an awful lot there, much of which I agree with and some of which I don't agree with. So let me just say, I think there was a brief period in time when there were three major networks on TV, and everyone watched Walter Cronkite or Huntley and Brinkley in the evening news, when everyone in the country was hearing the same thing pretty much, except there was still the John Birch Society reading their newsletter, and there was still still the Communist Party newspaper and the Socialist. I mean, you could still go out and get these other voices, but everyone was hearing the same voice. I think there was a very narrow envelope in time when that happened. Now we're back into a multiplicity of voices with none being authoritative. But I think it was that way before too, before radio and TV. I think that you didn't just read your local paper. You heard the Chautauqua speakers come around and give their talk about what was happening. You went to Cafe Society and heard you read what Voltaire was writing or what Rousseau was writing and so forth. There was this ongoing discussion back then and all these different points of view. And if you read what politics was like during Thomas Jefferson's time, and read his accounts of the arguments that people get into and how no one could talk to anyone else then because everyone had their own facts. It was the same then, okay, as it is now. Was Thomas Jefferson really a French spy? Those kinds of questions that kind of there were all kinds of conspiracy theories then that filled various kinds of broadsides that people get, maybe not full newspapers. So I don't think this idea that we live in a world where we can confirm our own biases is any different than the old world. So I don't think it's all that different.
I just want to hop in here for a second and say, being a woman and coming from a working class background,
Yeah.
coming from a working class background, it was really underclass. It was not even really just working class. I can't say that I agree because, I wasn't either listening to Walter Cronkite. We didn't have a television for a long time. I was listening to some radio.
Mhm.
I was trying to read the books in the library, trying to figure out what's going on. But there was a thread in the public schools. I was learning about virtues. I was also Catholic. I was following the Ten Commandments. I was a believer.
Mhm.
I went to catechism. I signed up for trying to understand what was going on, and there was some coherence and continuity in the story of it. And so, here I was in America where I thought the races did live together because they did.
Mhm.
And I was understanding virtues in the Ten Commandments, and I thought everybody was following that. And then once we did get a television, my mother would only turn it on at certain hours because I was not allowed to touch it. Neither was my father. It was treated as though it was a sacred object, honestly, but because I think she really didn't understand it. So she operated it, but we were all given the sort of directions for where we could watch it and when we could watch it. I didn't really associate anything with television or particularly the movies. I would go to a movie maybe once a month. And so I wasn't in that mix of sort of metropolitan culture, nor did I didn't know then about, the lack of sovereignty that women had. I thought women had been voting forever. So it really wasn't until I got out of Akron and got into university that I started understanding something that was called patriarchy, which I had not seen operating because the women seemed to be in charge of everything and the men were working in the factories. So I had thought that the women were the smarter people, seemed to me they were. They ran everything, they taught everything, and the men did all the hard labor. So I was living in this other world that had a coherence and that didn't seem at all like the world I got into. So, I just want to say that there are multiple worlds that we've each come from as well. And
Mhm.
I do tend to agree with Mike that that there's a lot more confusion right now, but particularly around this issue of virtue. So, I do want to go to the three philosophers that you've chosen, why you've chosen, not that they're not just philosophers, they're really actually spiritual systems or cultural, spiritual, civic systems, and they're different. And so, why did you choose those three?
I can give you reasons in retrospect why it was a good idea that I chose those three, but that's not how it happened. In hindsight, it just kind of happened. I mean, here I was a practicing Buddhist for many years. Okay, and I'd spent a couple of decades just trying to understand what was being said within Buddhism and all the different schools of it, and trying to kind of sort all that through. After retirement from active clinical practice, I joined a philosophy group, and one of the books we read was Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and the book was like getting hit in the head by a two by four for me. I said, oh, here's a whole different approach than the Buddhist approach, and yet there are a lot of similarities between the two. And so I was fascinated learning about that. And so I wrote this book in 2020 that was comparing the Buddhist idea of enlightenment with Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia, and how are they the same and how are they different and how are they influencing each other in Buddhism in the West today, often in an unrecognized way. So that was good. And then since I'm a Zen teacher and I'm studying Zen, I decided it's time to learn something more about Chinese culture and where the Zen literature comes from. So I began reading about Chinese philosophy and some of the works by Confucius and Mencius and people like that. Began learning a little bit of Chinese in order to accommodate it so I could understand the Zen stories better. And all of a sudden I said, here's this whole third tradition, totally independent from the Greek tradition and the Indian tradition. And it's also a virtue ethics tradition. It's talking about what's the nature of the good life, what is virtue, what is wisdom. And I'm saying, isn't this interesting? Here are three pre-Judeo-Christian systems. Okay, they don't believe in a God handing down commandments or anything of that sort. Okay, and they're giving you three different versions from three different civilizations about what it means to live a good life and be a good person. And what are the areas of difference and what are the areas of similarities? So that was one of the impetuses for this book, is that my own exploration of those three. And what I wanted to emphasize in the book was their commonalities rather than the differences. I mean, the differences are profound, and we can talk about that if we want to get there. But they also seem to say that the good life is a life in which one develops certain kinds of character strengths and capacities that we call the virtues, and also develops a kind of an ability to use discriminative wisdom or judgment to be able to kind of weigh situations that you find in and all the different complex factors in them, and which virtues are called for in that situation, and perhaps the virtues are in conflict. And in that case, how do you weigh which one? So there's a whole weighing or judging or discriminating process that goes on. And they're all saying, all three of them are saying, these are things, you want to develop these strengths, you want to develop these capacities. And they're all saying it takes a lifetime to do it, that you don't get really good at it, and then in 30 you're done. Okay. And it requires inquiry throughout a lifetime about what these things are, because our understanding of what they are grows as we hit novel situations and difficult situations and new tests, and we get a better understanding of them. And lastly, how do you develop that? You develop it by conscious intent and by practice, and by emulating other people that you think embody these qualities in some kind of way. So they're all kind of pretty much in agreement about that's what it means to live a good life. And having a good life just doesn't mean a material acquisition, but it means finding a way to live in a decent relationship to those people who are important to you in your life, and that you affect through your life as well. So it's not a self-centered sort of thing, but it's an appreciation of living in balance and in some kind of harmony with other people, despite all the complexities of doing that. One of the things I like
Yeah.
about it is that they're saying the reason for doing these things is not because God said you should do it, or
Mhm.
because we know for sure what the answer is. I mean, one of the great things about Plato is he goes around saying, "What is justice?" And he'll write a whole book, and he doesn't know. What is courage? He doesn't know. He's inquiring into it, and that's what they're inviting us to do. But the other thing they're saying is the reason that these are important is because they either contribute to some kind of vision of the good life, okay, or they actually constitute the culmination of the qualities that a good life actually is. So we can talk about in Buddhism, for example, that you practice loving kindness and compassion to get to become a Buddha, in quotes, okay? But what is a Buddha like? Someone who radiates compassion in every direction. So it's actually part of what we define as the end state that we want to reach as well.
All of these systems in some way develop a kind of path or way
Mhm.
to either emulate or practice virtues, and those virtues over time become more palpable as they're practiced, let's say, and then those virtues tend to lead to capacities, greater relational capacities, I guess, to interact with others, be aware of others,
I mean, it may be individual too, right? Uh,
intentionality.
and I
uh,
want to think about these as capacities we develop and we have at our disposal, but it doesn't mean that we always use them.
right.
There's also that practice about bringing them to mind, the whole idea of mindfulness in a Theravada sense of it, keeping the whole of the teachings in mind at all times and the goal in mind at all times. So there's a way in which we remind ourselves these are important to who we want to be and what we think a good person is, and we want to demonstrate this in this situation in some kind of way. And when we actually successfully embody that or realize this situation, we actually have a better feeling about ourselves in that moment.
Right, right. And that seems to be built into I think, most religions,
Hmm.
maybe not all philosophies. One sense that, I mean, I know Buddhism better than I know the other systems
Hmm.
because I've studied it a lot, just in line with democracy and the pluralism we've been talking about. And I would ask you this about the other systems as well. Number one, how much are women considered in that and their particularity of giving birth, reproduction, and so on? Maybe somewhat in Confucius, I don't know, but I think his sense of family is fairly strong, and that idea that people are honored in different ways by their roles. But also, the other issue that I find in Buddhism and early Buddhism, the Dhammapada and so on, the Buddha is always letting his followers know that there are some people that have too much sand in their eyes, that they won't get this, and he's going to leave them out. And
Hmm.
he's going to notice when he asks questions, who is who. So he's going to leave out what's translated often as the hoi polloi, or the people, that ones that are imagined not to be able to come along, do bad things to animals. They're the butchers.
So, I mean, we can say they all can be improved upon in that way.
Well,
Their vision was limited.
that was a vision that was pretty much shared,
Yep.
but the Tibetans, of course, I mean, other societies that did honor women because they recognized women were giving birth to all of them, not, they weren't just a category that was, let's say, disposable. But I'm sort of, what I'm trying to do is to try to get a sense of how can these virtues and how can these views about wisdom and a right way of living be inclusive now,
Okay.
include the kind of plurality that we've been talking about, of people kind of lost in their silos or their media or their despair.
Okay. I also want to go back to what you said about the Buddha, though, and how he didn't include everyone. I don't think that's quite fair. There's certainly some people with dust in their eyes, but they weren't the hoi polloi. They're more likely to be the mighty and powerful. For example, even a serial killer like Angridamala can
Yeah,
become enlightened in his
right.
system. So he doesn't, and women can become, like Dhammadina can become enlightened. He doesn't leave anyone out in that sense.
But if we, in our Sangha, we read the Dhammapada out loud,
Yes.
and it was embarrassing after a while.
Yeah.
because there was a lot of this sort of, here are the people that can learn this, and these are the people that cannot. And of course, it could be the wealthy, but there probably weren't that many wealthy
Okay, but
people
I mean,
around.
there are like over 10,000 sutras, and the Buddha didn't write most of them. And I don't know when the Dhammapada was actually written. It's probably get many hundreds of years after the Buddha lived. So
Yeah, oh,
they were reflective. What the Buddha actually thought and who he included. I don't want
yeah.
to malign him at this point. I think he was actually much more inclusive than we give
Okay,
credit for.
your Buddha was inclusive. I would say among the disciples, I always identified with Ananda. Ananda didn't actually make it into full enlightenment. He
Right.
was too intellectual. So I've always identified with Ananda. But I do feel that it is difficult for any path that is demanding, that involves wisdom and virtue, to include everyone. And how they deal with the people they don't include is very key.
Yeah.
Whether those are the women or those are the poorer people, the people that don't know how to do the meditation practice. I mean, eventually Buddhism develops and includes all of those people in all of the countries, because those people develop a path of faith, more or less. Their devotion and their chanting and their support for the monks and so on. I'm not a critic, really, of the Buddha.
I know. Your question is really about inclusiveness and
Yeah,
how do we not leave
about the
people out.
inclusiveness.
And I'm reminded, not that I think of Allen Ginsberg as an exemplar of anything really, other than occasionally being a good poet, but he did say, "Never give up on anyone." And I keep that thought in mind a lot of times. And when you look at the Buddhist teachings, he gives different teachings to different people because he sees they have different capacities. So he'll give someone who's going to be a householder, he'll give a different set of teachings to than someone who's a monastic, for example. Not because he thinks they're better or worse people, but because of their station in life. This is what's useful for you right now, and that's what I'm going to teach. So I think that's the way we have to look at things. And I think in anyone I am talking to, I want to believe that they have some capacity for awakening. You know, as we say in the Buddhist tradition, if not in this life, maybe the next, but still, I mean, there are some people who are so handicapped by their history of conditioning and trauma that it's hard for them to kind of see any other way than the way they are in the world. But even for them, you can hope that there could be some event in their life that might give them some. I'm thinking about the years that I worked as a chaplain, for example, in a medical surge unit. And so I talked to thousands of people about their lives as we were going through it from every walk of life and every condition. What I came away with more than anything else was most people want to live decent lives. Most people want to be good people as the way they understand what it means to be good people, no matter what their condition, no matter what their religion, no matter where they come from. And then you meet that 1 or 2% who don't. Psychopaths, narcissists, Machiavellians, people with the dark triad, as we say in psychology. There are some people who really just want to dominate and win and get the most of whatever they can out of any situation they're in. I can maintain a hope that something will change for them. I mean, you do hear these prison conversion stories, right? Chuck Colson goes to prison and, becomes a religious teacher, or, Malcolm X goes to prison and becomes a religious figure. People do have their moment on the road to Damascus where they do change. So I always hold out that hope for people. That's all I can do is hold out that hope. And I don't want to tell other people how to live, but I'm interested in having people inquire
Hmm.
about their lives and what do they think and how they came to their understanding of that. And do they see other opportunities or possibilities for themselves? I'm interested in opening people up in that way, if
So
they're willing to have that kind of conversation.
in the structure that you discovered the underlying commonalities
Hmm.
of these three philosophies and ways of life, is there something that you could offer as principles for a pluralistic society at this point where we are now? That would be a question that I think is really very key for, looking at essentially some of the, as you said, non-Western, non-monotheistic approaches that offer something that doesn't translate into anything like projecting your parent into the sky. It's these are all about following some structures, some principles, some practices in a way that will bring you to a better life.
Yeah. One person I haven't mentioned in this conversation and so forth, and he may be the philosopher who's had the biggest influence on me in recent years, is John Dewey. And when John Dewey talks about what democracy is, he doesn't talk about it as a set of practices like the franchise and balance of powers and stuff like that. He talks about it as an attitude that we have, that we want to create a society in which everyone has the opportunity to flourish in the way they understand flourishing as best they can. That's the goal. We want to all work together so we can create this place where we can all realize our individual dreams in some kind of way, understanding that dreams can sometimes be in conflict and your dream may harm me in some kind of way. And so we want to put some limits on it, but we want to have this ongoing conversation about how do we do that. And that means that you always have to be willing to hear somebody else, no matter how much you disagree with them, and understand the place that they're coming from. And that you also have to be willing to compromise. That in order to get some of what I want, I may have to give this other person some of what they want. And I think when democracy works well, that's what happens. We reach compromises and we inch along, you know. So for example, we talk about women getting the vote in 1921. They didn't all of a sudden just get it in 1921. Individual states gave women the vote for their specific, not everything on the ballot. Maybe they could vote for their governor, or maybe they could vote for their local mayor, you know. But that happened first, you know, and then and that giving women the vote nationally for the presidency, that was the culmination of a project that took 75 years. We think about the way that Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson first talk about national health service that was run by the government. Okay, how long did it take to get to Medicare, and how many years after that to Medicaid, and then to, you know, Obamacare? And we're still not at universal health care, but we inch along, and we do it through all kinds of compromises. You know, I'm listening to Kamala Harris talk about the bill that almost passed the Senate on immigration. Okay, and she was being questioned on it the other day because it included building a segment of a wall on the border. And she was being asked by somebody, well, how can you include that? Didn't you think the wall was a stupid idea? And I wish she had been able to say it, but she couldn't. Yes, personally, I think the wall's a stupid idea, but if you want to get some of what I want, I have to give you some of what you want. So let's all get a little bit of what we want. It won't be perfect, but we'll pass something. We'll get along together. We'll be if not friends, we'll be people who can make a deal together in some kind of way. I think that's the attitude that we have to have, that we're not enemies in this world, that we're not strangers, but we're people with different views, and getting along is always hard. It's never easy, but it means that making the effort at mutual understanding and mutual recognition that your needs may be different than mine, and realizing that I don't always get my way in things.
That's what we, you know, basically the Center for Real Dialogue, which is what Mike and I are associated with, and the practice of real dialogue is exactly, you know, you're saying what the goals are.
Yeah.
We focus especially, though, on the fact that each one of us has a first-person experience, the way we perceive things, the way we understand things. So it takes a while to just speak for yourself, and then to listen mindfully, ask people questions, be curious, so that no one is left out. You know, that so
and to understand also that when you talked about being an idiot before, understand that my opinions are just my opinions. They're not anything more than that.
Well, and yeah, I mean, so obviously in the end, when I practice real dialogue, I recognize that so deeply. I mean, I start to see the value of people having other points of view other than mine, because my point of view is so limited. You know, I'm limited to my little bubble, we call it a snow globe. And in my snow globe, hey, you know, I grew up in Akron, Ohio, and I didn't know there was the rest of the world for a long time. So I have certain ways of being that are coming from my particularity, and someone else has very different ways of being coming from theirs. It's a matter of gradually, slowly making the inquiry and recognizing, yes, we have dreams that might be different. Can we make room just for the differences? And then gradually, you know, perhaps we can come to some problem solving. Many times I hear, you know, the idea of the climate crisis. The climate crisis is a bunch of people talking together. Mm-hmm. And if they cannot talk about what the issues are and listen to the other side, there really won't be any solution, because it's just polarized then. And then the different groups just split up. There are schisms and schisms and schisms in every group here in Vermont, in every town meeting, and everything, because there's often the feeling here in Vermont, where we have very progressive liberal politics, that only one side counts.
Right.
There's one right side, and we've got to make case for that. It doesn't work. It
never works. It never works.
Yeah, it doesn't work. And so
the question is, the question I think you're asking is, how do we change, gradually make shifts in the culture so that way of thinking becomes more accepted by more and more people over time? And the answer is, there's no magic to doing that. It's just hard work. And I write my book, and you have your podcast, and you have the Real Dialogue Institute, and so forth. And if everyone is trying, and there are the Better Angels who are at work, you know, holding dialogues, if everyone,
And we do work with them. Yes,
yeah,
just
yeah,
they're great. They're
brave
great.
ranges, okay. But gradually maybe there can be a shift. In some ways, it's like I think what we need is not so much a political revolution and economic revolution, but a kind of moral or ethical revolution. And I think you and I and people listening to this podcast are part of that right now.
I believe what we're talking about is building a relationship in order to be able to compromise. We've we seem like I notice when I speak with people from first person perspective, if I have truth and I make you into an enemy, there's no discussing how we're going to compromise, and neither of us will ever get what we need.
Mhm.
The ability to be able to compromise, as we've mentioned here, right, where I may get a little bit, you may get a little bit, and it's and the challenge with that is nobody ever gets really what they fully want.
That's right.
But
There's no utopia in the end, and that's why it's hard to get people around this idea.
right, right. Actually, I just listened to a 30-something-year-old comedian talk about this with his wife. They're talking about getting a new car. He wants this vehicle, she wants that vehicle, and they both are realizing neither of them are going to be happy because the compromise is they're going to get something neither of them want. But where we lose, I guess, our focus is what's the purpose of the car? Is it to feed your ego of how people perceive you, or is it to get you from one place to another safely? And so maybe that's bringing this into how we compromise and how we flourish is in trying to understand, to collaborate, to have empathy for the other person and acknowledge that, like, this is what I want. I hear what you want. Is there any way we can compromise so that maybe we each don't get what we want, but we move in the direction of getting more of what we want in our life or in our lives? So how do we bring that kind of flourishing in? And I think what I'm hearing you say as part of this is bringing ethics back into the conversation.
Mhm.
And at least from our conversations on stage development, it's only after we transcend conscientious conformity that I begin to define my own set of ethics, that I don't just absorb the enculturated ethics of my peers and the people I conform to. And maybe it's in that transition that we can transcend, I'm right, this is the way it's got to be, and I've got to get mine. And I can have a little bit more compassion for those who don't have, like I think about my friends who are significantly younger than me, and I look at how much of, for example, their income goes to housing. And I live in a very inexpensive city compared to New York, to the coasts. St. Louis is I think a below average cost of living city. And I
Yes.
see their struggles. There's actually relatively high wages here compared to cost of living. And it's still a struggle. I can't even imagine what it's like to have to share a room with 20 people in New York to be able to have affordable housing if you're just beginning your journey. So, how do we get the people in our society who maybe have a little more, who have a lot more power, who have somewhat more wealth to empathize with and to open up and help those who have less? I think this is a great ethical dilemma of our time.
Well, it's always the ethical dilemma. I mean, there are always people who have more and people who have less, and
What would Confucius say about this question? Just can you quickly, I mean, can you say here's Confucius on this wealth gap?
well, he I don't think he had a problem with hierarchy. I mean, kings ought to have more money than peasants. I mean, that's
That's
just the
right.
natural way of the world. I don't think economic justice would have really entered into his opinion. Other than that, everyone should have enough to eat and and a roof over their head.
Right. That, I mean, that's what I thought you would say. That's why I brought Confucius
Right.
forward on that, because I was having a conversation just like 2 days ago with an Indian friend of mine who's a psychiatrist, and
Mhm.
he's on our board at the Center for Real Dialogue. And he said, what bothers him so much, he's the head of the inpatient psychiatry at the University of Vermont Medical Center. He works a lot with the homeless in Burlington. What bothers him so much about America is the fact that there's no dignity in being poor here.
Mhm.
He said, with his family in India, they had people living under their house essentially in a small space, like a 32-foot space was a woman and her two children, 32 square feet. And she and the children would work in the house and felt at ease with the family. They would go down and then cook their dinner and have their things in their 32 square foot place in the evening. The children would play outside and so on and so forth. And what he was saying is that because of because really of the system that they were in, the dharma, let's say, the structure, this woman could feel okay. Her husband lived elsewhere. She could feel okay about her life. She said, okay, in another life, I might be living in the house like that. But in this life, I'm living in this house. I'm fulfilling myself. So, that's very different than dealing with a homeless person in Burlington who has no feeling of dignity, who has no place in society. So he was simply speaking in this way. And I thought, wow, I sort of understand the caste system differently in the way that he's speaking about it. He's not speaking also about someone who's untouchable. He's speaking about someone who's in the Shudra. I think it's that part of the caste that serves and feels satisfied with serving. And so, part of what it seems like we've lost track of with our wealth gap and with all of the issues surrounding what's available to people is that there may be different status that people will need in order to fulfill whatever it is that their own life is about. And that on the other side of this issue that, something that Mike was bringing up earlier, all of this wealth now is on display in the internet. Previously, people's wealth was hidden. An anthropologist friend of mine was pointing this out. Then in all of the earlier societies where there was this huge gap, the royalty or the aristocrats, they were kind of behind the closed walls. The people that were over on the servant class, they weren't seeing every set of horses, every beautiful gown and so on. Now, Jeff Bezos' stuff is online. So you can envy it if you want to, if you feel that, okay, here's somebody that has all this stuff and I have, my little shoebox. So that also kind of enters into it. It's like there's no place to have dignity and be on this other end of a spectrum. So, I assume that Confucius was kind of thinking along the lines of my Indian friend, that there's no dignity. I mean, there is dignity in being at all levels.
Well, as I mentioned before, I think all the ideas we have about what's fair and what's honest and what's courageous undergoes historical change.
Yes.
And so for someone living in Aristotle's time or Confucius' time or even the Buddha's time, the Buddha never talked about equality, economic equality for people. There was the idea, well, yeah, some people are rich and some people are poor, and that's samsara, and the wheel goes around, and that was that. I think with the advent of Marx, okay, we have a new idea about what fairness means. Okay, it's very different from what people thought before, and we're still working through what does that mean. People ought to have equality of opportunity, we say, but what does that mean? And we define, well, does that mean equal health care and equal education, or does it just mean they can use their own smarts and cultural strengths, to kind of pursue whatever goals they want. It's not clear what we mean. Should people end up roughly equivalent? Is it okay if somebody has $1 billion, but it's not okay if they have 200 billion? I mean, we haven't worked out the ethics of this yet, and I think it's still in motion. I don't know what it will be like 100 years from now. What we'll think.
And returning to Confucius, though, didn't we have a social duty to feed the hungry? Wasn't there a relationship? There was a role in society, so you didn't ignore it, you didn't hide it. Part of that was you shared a bowl of rice.
The idea was
the
the emperor
beggar
should be like a parent to the people, and the emperor's job was to take care of the people, and it was everyone had their particular duties to each other in that way. So yes, an emperor just couldn't be self-serving in his view of things. That wouldn't be a real emperor.
I do think there is some natural human tendency to not be simply self-serving. I think that natural tendency comes out of infancy because, human infancy lasts a long time. And let's say it's just beginning to be over after around 2 years. During that time, there are people gazing into the eye of the infant, and the infant needs those people to look alive, to be awake, to be engaged. That infant is trying to evoke care. So that infant has to experience something like compassion, has to be able to feel the feelings of the other person, to evoke that back again, to have that feeling of I'm caring for you because you're caring for me. And I do think that is a universal human tendency, compassion. I think that's very different from love or interest or other things.
And you see, yeah, go ahead.
That is there.
You see it very clearly in the Confucian tradition, by the way, when Mencius tells the story about someone seeing a child about to fall into a well. Yeah. And he says anybody who saw that would feel alarm and distress at seeing that. And he says we're all born what he calls the duan, the seed, what he calls humaneness or human-heartedness. The word in Chinese is ren. Because we were
Uh-huh.
born with the seed of that. And he says, and someone who didn't have these wouldn't even be human.
Right.
So they certainly agree with that. And for the Confucians, that human-heartedness or humaneness that I translate as benevolence in my book, that's the number one key virtue of all, having that feeling, human feeling. I'm also thinking about when I was teaching at Yale, one of my colleagues at the head of the department was a guy by the name of Sidney Blatt, who was a
Oh, yeah.
psychoanalyst. And Sidney talked about the two tracks of human development, he called them the two. So he said the one track is the one of individuation, defining who I am, what's my identity. But the other track is how do I connect with other people? And he said that he saw human development as a kind of moving back and forth between these two tracks, but that a healthy person was able to do the both define themselves and then see what their connection was to other people as well. And
Yes.
I
Yes.
think that's, for me, that was one of the most profound statements of all about what it means to really kind of develop as a human being.
Well, I do think that, this idea of this Ren, or this, when you use the word benevolence, unfortunately for me, sounds a little bit like philanthropy, and
Uh,
so I found myself reacting to that. I knew what you were getting at, but the idea of charity and
yeah,
philanthropy, I react against from having, the childhood that I had,
I
basically.
understand. I pick benevolence because sometimes Ren is translated as benevolence, but also David Hume in his treatise on ethics talks
Mhm,
about benevolence, and for him that includes compassion, it includes love, kindness, mercy, humility.
mhm.
I mean, all those are included in there. So
So yeah, I mean, I still tend to like the word compassion, because even in English, it means suffering with. It
yeah,
means the companioning of that suffering,
mm,
and I do believe that humans naturally are drawn to helping when there is something that is suffering, and that if to walk by, for example, a homeless person begging requires you to remove yourself. You can't do that just naturally. You can't just do it because you feel that you need to help or want to help. Then you perhaps get into a discursive thought. Well, what could I do to actually help? Would this person use the money to buy drugs? Blah blah blah. So then you pass by, but that there is within our nature that desire to engage, to help when we experience directly the suffering of someone. I don't think that we feel the same thing on the internet much at all. I mean, unless you have the distinctive individual there, but that I I think that there is, as a primary aspect to being human, this two-ness or this togetherness, that the secondary is the solo individual.
yeah, I agree with that. And and to complicate it, I want to say that we have a split intuition about these things. On the one hand, we think that whenever we see suffering anywhere, if somebody steps in a dog's paw and we hear it whelp, we feel compassion for it. So any suffering that we see right in front of us, it's natural to feel some compassion. We feel like we owe something to everybody in that
Mhm.
way. But we also think we owe more to our group, my children, my spouse, my family, my ethnicity, my country. It's like compassion is a limited quantity that we have.
Freud certainly points that out in his essay on narcissism.
Yeah,
Yes.
but I think it's harder for us to extend, to people on the other side of the world, to people we only see on TV. I mean, we might feel a little bit briefly, but to really have it sustain our behavior and motivate us to make real change in some kind of way, it's very hard for that to happen. So, and I think in times of scarcity, there's a tendency for us to kind of circle the wagons around just my group. Screw them, I'm in favor of my group. In times of plenty, then we can be more generous and say, yeah, let's include everybody. But it's something I think we all struggle with. And there's a professor at Rutgers University by the name of Tao Jiang, the Chinese philosopher, and he says that all of Chinese philosophy during this period of the Warring State period, when we have not only Confucianism, but we have Taoism and all these, the Baizhou, the 100 schools of philosophy, they all revolve around this issue about what do I owe
Mhm.
my group versus what do I owe the country or the state or the emperor.
Mhm.
Every one of these philosophers comes up with a somewhat different answer about where to draw that balance.
Mhm. Well, I mean, I think the issue is also partly that humans really are shaped by their emotional development. Our emotions are so primary, way more primary than our reason.
Yeah.
And, again, if you have the people that are writing the philosophy are mostly the people that are not having the babies, they don't have first hand experience of a lot of this. And so it becomes abstracted, very quickly becomes abstracted rather than direct experience. I do think that the emotional involvement with an infant, the amount of care that it takes, the amount of sacrifice. I mean, the fact that, the baby is coming in through your own body and you're giving up your nutrition, etc., for this being, then you give up a great deal more after it painfully gets out, and it's heroic to get it out. After all that happens, it makes a deep impression. There's a deep impression there, and some recognition that that long caregiving period kind of wires people to want to care, and then other things come into conflict with that. And often what does come into conflict with it is anxiety. And anxiety, the fight or flight, the sense of I'm threatened or my group is threatened, can really be then a conflict with that primary desire that I would say is very primary, to be compassionate, to care, to be engaged. But what it comes into conflict with it is the threat. And that then, gradually all of that becomes languaged into this is my tribe, this is my family, this is my culture. All of that's very secondary and, still remains a little abstract. So, from my point of view, having, and I've talked in this podcast endlessly about my daughter's birth. She can't really stand to listen to the podcast anymore. So she was my first child and she weighed 10 pounds, and I had my first Enlightenment experience, giving birth, 14-hour birth, no drugs. I wanted to do that. I was a Zen student already. But that experience changed me more profoundly than anything else in my life up till then. And, I'd studied a lot. I was just 25, but I'd already studied Zen. I'd been practicing Zen. I studied a lot of philosophy, but that childbirth thing was profound. We all get here that way. We all get here just as one way. And I do think it has a big effect, and wonder if there's a way for people to somehow kind of rope it back to the idea that our dependence on other people and our dependence on being witnessed, is so primary that I always think, like, if Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, neither of whom I know, if they could give up a bunch of stuff. I mean, if a bunch of people could give up a bunch of stuff, it could become more shared. Now, I don't think that the communists have it right. I don't think you form a committee and tell who to give up what. It has to come somehow from a change of heart. And that change of heart, I think, can come from these spiritual or virtuous practices. And so I still feel that there's a lot of hope in, say, practices like what you're describing and what we're engaged in, getting out to people so they have knowledge that there is such a way of being that doesn't involve becoming, a billionaire. Like, becoming a billionaire to me is offensive. It's grotesque. I don't see how it could make anyone happy, because there's such control of wealth. And why? So I think these other practices, now here I am, a woman who's had the babies and all that, saying that, but I think that the practices that come through compassion, care, that show how to live with a way, whether it's a structured way like Confucianism or a less structured way, some ways as Buddhism. Buddhism is a little less structured, or it's John Dewey, with his sense of a practical community and so on.
I love what you said about motherhood and that experience and the primacy of that connection, and the wanting to be seen, and everything you've said about that. I want to be a skeptic, though, for a moment.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about the Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who wrote a book in the 1930s called Immoral Society and Moral Man. And it's one of those books that has had more of an effect on me than anything I've ever read, at least within the last few years it's been. But he says, a billionaire can decide to be a more moral person and give up his money. And that happens from time to time, right? People do become selfless and give away everything they have. He says, but no social group has ever given up its privilege willingly. Never made a decision as a group to do that. And so he says that no privileged group has ever relinquished its privilege freely. And then he also says that no minority has ever given into a majority without at least the threat of force somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Not talking about individuals now. He's individuals being moral, societies. It's the same story all the way down. It's so he's a pessimist about social change and social evolution. So I just want to raise that yeah, I agree with you. The communists don't have the answer, appointing a committee and deciding who gets what. But I think the idea that we'll reach some kind of place where all the billionaires decide, okay, let's get together as a group and decide to, I mean, Warren Buffett gives away half his money, and we have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So some people give away a lot of their money, but
But they do that in a way that is very controlled, that's controlled on what they
yeah,
take.
I'm not going to say they always do it wisely or well,
Don't
but
do it, maybe.
they could be like Jeff Bezos though, or and decide to keep it all, right? But they're
I really don't know. Honestly, I have to say that I don't know any of these people or
right.
exactly what they do, but I think that, I've certainly heard the not giving up willingly many, many times that, no one gives up power willingly, no one gives up status willingly.
Individuals do, but social groups, you say, don't do that.
Social groups,
Everyone will get together and say, okay, we're gonna give our privilege away to somebody else. Let me give you a specific example of it. Okay, I believe in diversity and inclusion and equity. Okay, and I think on the whole, I think that affirmative action was a good idea. Okay, I think businesses and schools ought to include more people from more diverse backgrounds, and especially make up for the history of slavery and Jim Crow and the culture of racism. On the other hand, I have children and I want them to do well, and they're white children, and I want them to get into the best college they can get into and I want them to have all the advantage in life that whatever privilege I've been able to acquire in life, I can pass on to them. Okay. There's that conflict inherent about, yes, I do want something for other people, but I also want something for myself. And what happens? They've never really come into direct conflict. My child against a black child getting into the same space in a college, for example. But if they did, I wonder how I would feel about that and what I would decide, you know?
Well, I've never actually had that kind of conflict, but so my children have gone to elite colleges, and that was partly because of the friends' schools. I sent them to high school and thinking these Quaker high schools were going to provide certain kinds of virtues, or they provided actually a very privileged class of peers. But ultimately, what I have felt for my children is that I want them to have resilience, and I want them to be able to understand what it means to take on an autonomous struggle,
Mhm.
that they would feel that life was theirs somehow, not me sort of, making it safe or making it, not that I've done this perfectly either, but really to allow them to get out there and wrestle with it and do it in their own way was more important to me. Now I have to say that's how I grew up.
Mhm.
I didn't grow up with financial advantages, but I grew up around a lot of resilient people that were sort of wrestling the alligators to the ground. And, and I liked that. And it gave me a lot of ability to go to work. When I was in high school, I took a job as a telephone operator, and
Mhm.
that was hard work. I worked and brought the money home, and I was still a straight A student, and I was still a leader of student government. Now I was exhausted. I hardly got any sleep, but I learned that I could do that.
Mhm.
And to me, that was the greatest gift, because then I never worried that I could make my way in the world. I started early. And it's like I do think that there are other values that people can think of for their children that,
Sure.
might bring advantages to the children that are greater than, an elite college and university. Now, as I look back, I wish we hadn't done that. I
Mhm.
wish we hadn't borrowed so much money, to go to Oberlin, Clark University, Colorado College. Everybody got some great career stuff out of that. But honestly, they also bumped shoulders with too many kind of, Jeff Bezos type people. And not not that they were that wealthy, but that put them into a different mindset than I've had, you
Mhm.
know. And I look back at that and I think, uh, I sort of wished for the state university. It's I want to bring Mike back in. I know we're about to close up here, but I think we've touched on lots of interesting stuff.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in with a couple of points. So I don't think anybody would agree that Andrew Carnegie was an ethical standard to hold oneself to, and yet he turned his wealth into libraries in every community across this country. So no matter what you may think of him in the end, and honestly, I don't know if it matters if he thought that was what was going to get him into heaven at the end of his life by doing that, but he certainly changed the lives of so many people in this country. I look at the legacy in this city of how many Carnegie libraries there still are here, and it's amazing. They were architecturally beautiful, and they brought wisdom and knowledge and made it accessible to everyone in community. So there was that relationship of interconnectedness where he didn't take it with him and he gave give it back to a community. I don't know if it undid some of the things he may have done, but it certainly left a lasting legacy that changed this country for the better for multiple generations. And I just want to go back to this notion of when we come together, it tends to be, it seems to me that it's in the aftermath of a disaster that somehow that raises our compassion. If you look at the response worldwide to 9/11 or to the tsunami, which was on the other side of the world, but the immediacy of the internet brought it to the forefront. When I can see it for myself, I can have compassion to those people who had no idea really what was coming. And the same with what's going on with the hurricanes here, what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in the Ukraine. So I do believe that these events can bring out humility, compassion, and the insight that I do have, maybe it's not obligation, but a duty, a responsibility to give back when I can. I've met many people who, whenever something happens in this country, there's a disaster, they leave their families and lives and head off into danger to go help others. And the people they go to help don't often look like them, don't often come from the same socioeconomic backgrounds, and yet this is a part of our nature that counters that selfish tendency, which may be echoed in the media and in the internet. And yet, in your community, when you think about the people you know, how many of them have gone out of their way to help others who were in need? And so that sense of what can we do to foster flourishing through compassion without the need for disasters on a scale that shake us out of our selfish silos. What can we do to help each other to remember that it is about right relationship, it is about right action, and how we bring this into our everyday lives, which is really where it makes a difference, whatever we think of intellectually, wherever we identify. And I wanted to earlier say, so much of this has to do with, I will use it as a false sense of identity. I identify with this self, I identify with this tribe, and yet there are different experiences, whether it's a spontaneous awakening, whatever it is, that breaks us out of that identity, where we see that that's a shell that has kept us separate from having a much bigger, broader world. And recently, I've been thinking about this in terms of bringing back a re-enchantment and a sense of pregnancy of giving birth to the future, right? From our last episode recording, re-enchanting our lives, that we've lost this awe, the power of awe, which brings humility. It puts us in perspective of that we're a small part of something much larger, much, much larger, that has always been, that may always be. So it's only here and now that I can make my difference, that I can shine my light. And it isn't about me. The light isn't mine. It's this paradox that I'm part of something much, much brighter, much larger. And so how do I keep my perspective and maintain that humility and bring it into my everyday interactions with each other, with the people I come across?
Yeah. I just want to add one thing to what I've been saying, and that is that even if you're looking at the small scale, the granular scale of everyday life, it's really that connection with other people that makes us happy, and not selfish activities. So I forget who the researchers were, but I remember one study done a number of years ago, a college campus where they had students keep diaries of their daily activities, including selfish activities like buying jewelry or smoking pot or masturbating or whatever it is, and then eudaimonic ones, spending time with a friend and helping them out, donating to a charity, and so forth. And then later on, they had students rate how happy they were, how meaningful they felt their lives were, and so forth. The number of self-gratifying activities they engaged in had nothing to do with how happy they were, zero correlation. But the amount that they gave to others and did what they thought were moral things, that increased their sense of both meaning and happiness. So I think one of the problems we're mistaken about what makes us happy, really. I'm not necessarily anti-capitalist, but a culture where we're selling more and more, having people buy more and more is the way that you think you become happy.
That's a great way to close and to kind of return back to this idea of virtue and wisdom.
Mhm.
The virtue that you're emphasizing is actually that virtue that connects to what I call our primary compassion, that we have. We're already equipped to be compassionate. by the time we get language, we've already practiced compassion, or we
Mhm.
would die because we have to get involved with the other people that take care of us. And then there's a wisdom in that because it does lead to happiness.
Mhm.
You know, that the happiness that we have, that is the greatest happiness all our lives, is the happiness that's reflected back in someone else's happiness. And we can feel that, we feel it in a very deep way. So I think the systems of practice and philosophy and so on that teach that are the ones that can bring people forward sort of out of the dilemma of what you would call, selfishness or self-other, because really, in a sense, it's not a dilemma. There's a clear path. It's just that many people don't know about it or haven't been taught it now. I believe that is why you wrote this book. I mean, I think you wanted to contribute somehow to a new vision for society that included the virtues, that included the moral, let's say, foundations that we need to find some kind of abiding happiness, that we may have lost track of in this recent time. That I do feel this recent time has been about a lot of wealth accumulation in this country. Like I know there was royalty and aristocracy and a whole lot of other stuff earlier, but it was within some kind of system that made it maybe more palpable, or I mean, sorry, more palatable, more humane, because it was sort of in this structure. Now it's in this kind of chaotic framework that that there's a sort of sense that everybody should try to be a billionaire, which is a complete idiocy. It's not even it's not even wrong. It's just so stupid. So I hope that your work will be another contribution to lead people away from that and to a recognition that this underlying virtue really is the way to happiness. There's no question, really.
I think you summed it up beautifully, Vali. I can't add anything to it.
I agree.
But I thank you for being on the podcast, for writing the book, for being who you are, for being my friend. And